Welcome on in, everybody, to the ultimate celebration of Saturday Night Live's greatest cast members of all time. My name is John from the SNN. Very excited to be with you for what is headed towards the culmination of weeks and weeks of this countdown of the top 50 SNL cast members of all time. We are now down to 12, 11, and 10 to be revealed tonight, getting to that top 10, the elite of the elite names in SNL history. And I cannot wait to do this show tonight because I think that this will be potentially the most fascinating show that we have. I think we have three people that we're going to talk about tonight that are very debatable because they are so good in so many ways, but in others, I'm not sure. And we're going to compare them to some other people we have on the list tonight. And I can't wait to get into all of those discussions with two great people we have on the podcast tonight and everyone in the live chat. So first, let me bring in the wonderful Kirsten Rayala. Kirsten, how are you?
I'm great. Trying to stay warm in Toronto. It's a great time to just stay inside and watch TV. So this works out well for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. What a month we have ahead of us between the end of this countdown and then the 3 episodes of Saturday Night Live that were revealed today. In case you missed the news, we already knew about Emma Stone and Noah Kahan coming up this weekend. We also have Adam Driver and Olivia Rodrigo the following week. Going to be unreal. And then we end the first half of the season with Kate McKinnon making her return to Saturday Night Live with musical guest Billie Eilish, also a former SNL host. So much to get into there. We're going to be talking about those over the next few weeks. That will be taking up all of our coverage throughout December. But for now, let's turn our attention to these next 3 and bring in our other guest here tonight. And that would be the great Eric from SNL Lytics. Is that how you say it, Eric?
Welcome all in. You can say it however you want, John.
Welcome in, Eric.
Thanks, John. Really excited to be here. I'm excited about the news that we've gotten today. I'm going to be in New York next week and maybe the following week. So fingers crossed that I might get to do some standby line.
Yeah, that would be very exciting. Yeah, like I said, I really can't wait to talk about all of those shows. In particular, Kate making her return to the show since we got to cover her for the last couple seasons as a cast member. And just, it's so exciting. This is the best time of year to be an SNL fan. Cannot wait to talk through all of that. But first, let's talk about the cast members we have revealed so far on the list. So we have 38 cast members we have spoken about up until this point. It's been weeks and weeks where we have revealed them every single time. And now I'm going to put the list of names up on the screen. So if you're watching us live, we're going to talk through who we have revealed so far. So spoilers again, if you're just jumping in at the end of the countdown, you may want to go back and watch some previous shows. But here we go. Let's talk about this list from 50 all the way to 13. I will reveal that we have Kevin Nealon, Joe Piscopo, David Spade, Mikey Day, Tracy Morgan, Chevy Chase, Jimmy Fallon, Bowen Yang, Martin Short, Sherry O'Terry. From 40 up, we have Ego Wodum, Taron Killam, Chris Parnell, John Lovitz, Beck Bennett, Jane Curtin, Seth Meyers, Daryl Hammond, Anna Gasteyer, Bobby Moynihan. From 30 up, we have Tim Meadows, Vanessa Bayer, Bill Murray, Rachel Dratch, Adam Sandler, Jan Hooks, Adie Bryant, John Belushi, Molly Shannon, and Andy Samberg. Into the top 20, we have Norm Macdonald, Mike Myers, Will Forte, Dan Aykroyd, Jason Sudeikis, Fred Armisen, Maya Rudolph, and Chris Farley revealed last week on the show. Kirsten, I know you were on with us earlier in this podcast series. Would love to know how you feel like the list has come together so far.
I mean, I love it. I'm really glad that Taron Killam's on there because he's often forgotten as a great cast member. So I'm thrilled to see that he's on this list. I thought Martin Short might be a bit higher, but when I looked down the list, I don't know where to put him because everyone is so great. So at this point, it's the best of the best. And gosh, I don't even know I don't know how you're doing this. I'm just thrilled to be talking about all of these people because they all deserve to be here. And we could argue all day and night about what exact order, but I think we're really darn close. Like, I don't have complaints about this.
All right. Well, Eric, you've been in the chat every single week watching this breakdown live, and I would love to know your thoughts on how the list has come together. What do you think, how the listeners have done so far?
Yeah, I think if you just put together a list of the top, 38 people so far, I think these are the right names on the list. The order is definitely debatable. There are some people who, I definitely feel are too low. I think I would probably move up. Piscopo, actually, Jane Curtin, I definitely have way higher. Jan Hooks. But there are people who are, it's pleasantly surprising to see them this high. So like people like Vanessa Bayer, Tim Meadows, Rachel Dratch. There's a lot of those people who, are generally kind of underrated by people who don't necessarily watch the show as much as we do. And it's nice to see their names recognized so high on the list. So you give and you take, and this is what you end up with. So overall, good product.
Definitely. I think it's an interesting thought experiment about names that didn't make the top 50 and, should they be there? I think that's a conversation we will have 3 weeks from now when we reveal the top 3 and have the full list to talk about. I think there's 3 or 4 names that I've been thinking about that probably should be there. But for the most part, I think that these are the right names as well. They're all within the top 50 or give or take a few numbers. But I think the top 12 that we have is really interesting. These are some names that I'm so excited to talk about. So Kirsten, Eric, are you ready to get into the first person we're going to talk about tonight?
Let's do it.
All right, let's do it. Let's do it. All right. This is a very famous person from Saturday Night Live's history, somebody whose legacy is extremely strong. And I am very excited to get into the conversation to talk about this cast member at number 12 is Tina Fey here. 6 seasons on Saturday Night Live from 2000 to 2006 as a cast member. She also was a writer for 2 more and a head writer for 1 more. So 3 more seasons in addition to those 6 on the show. Clearly changed the game for women at the show, being a head writer there. Just her legacy is so strong in that aspect of things. Was mostly relegated to Weekend Update throughout her tenure as a cast member. Did some other stuff as well. You'll see in the SPE here where we talk about that 1.66 as a cast member. So if you think someone's traditionally just on Update, they would be closer to 1.00, but here we have 1.66. So just something to think about as we start to talk about her history on the show. Of course, hosted 6 times as well. That it will, that number is different to everybody depending on how they feel. Should that be included in terms of her legacy, the fact that she's come back? But if you're going to count her hosting appearances, I certainly think you have to count her time as Sarah Palin on the show, which was, voted as one of the greatest impressions in SNL history. So there's so much to talk here from Tina and her tenure at the show. Kirsten, I'll start with you. What do you think about Tina and her placement here at 12?
I mean, at this point, again, there's so many incredible people. I think she isn't in the top 10 because she did spend so much time on Weekend Update and was a little bit more behind the scenes. And if you look at someone like Will Ferrell, who I'm going to assume is in the top 10 and became so well known for the sketches and the character work, and that type of person would overshadow her and bump her out of the top 10, I believe. But when I think about Tina Fey, I think about a trailblazer. So I think she being in the top 12, she's 12, is right for all that she did for women on the show.
Yeah, trailblazer is certainly a word to describe Tina's time on the show. There are a lot of factors to consider when comparing her to other cast members. So, Eric, I know you've been, I believe, putting together a list of your own. How do you look at Tina Fey, her place at the show, and where she comes in here from the fans?
Yeah, this is definitely the hardest person, I think, of any cast member to rank, just because of sort of, if you just took an eye test of her time on the show as a cast member and you didn't know anything behind the scenes, I don't think that she winds up anywhere close to this high. But if you know all that behind the scenes stuff, if you know how she brought together all the women on the show, and if you have the context of everything that she did after the show, whether it be Sarah Palin, her hosting, even 30 Rock, which is, sort of a show about SNL. So I think it sort of adds to her legacy there. That sort of puts a whole lot of weight in her favor. I have a little statistic I've brought here. So just about her legacy on the show. So there's this website called Sporkle. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but it's this sort of trivia website where a lot of the quizzes are, try to name every president of the United States or every state in the United States. So there's one quiz where you try to name every single cast member on SNL. And Tina Fey, of all the cast members, if you look at the statistics of the quiz, the most people have guessed Tina Fey. So most people remember Tina Fey on the show over, some, season 1 legends. some current cast member legends, she's the one who sort of gets the most recognition. So I think that people remember her well. And if anything, that's what brings her up to this point.
I love that because I've actually done that Sporkle quiz before, and I always miss like 2 or 3 cast members, and like Mike Murray always like shoves it in my face because he can remember every like he could just name them off, and it's crazy. But I agree, name recognition, she's huge. You know, you talk about Mean Girls, you talk about 30 Rock, like these things are huge factors here. Her connection, her ability, her connections with other SNL cast members to bring the women of SNL at the time and become this posse of people who will then go on and work on other projects and really define a generation for the show. I think, like I said, those are all legacy factors here. I just want to put everything out on the table and then we can talk about some of those moments. From my criteria, when I look at her, I mean, was she meant for SNL? I certainly think that she's a brilliant writer. I think that she's contributed to a lot of the great moments in the show. Was her, place in life to be on Saturday Night Live? I would say no, not necessarily. Like, she was great on the show, but could she have done something else? I do think so. I think that, like, I wouldn't say that she was just like built in a lab for Saturday Night Live, because I just think she's so talented. So I'll probably dock a couple points there. From a statistics perspective, she doesn't dominate the show, but that was, where she put herself when she, auditioned to become Weekend Update anchor and then head writer. She was never going to be in a million sketches. So you sort of have to look at the caveat of the analytics here in comparing her to other people. But then, she does come back and host 6 times and shows her chops in terms of being in a ton of sketches every time she hosts, and shows that she has the ability to do that. So part of me actually wishes that back in the day she was in more sketches, because I think that when she did a very good job with most of them. So those are things that I think about here. I think that the biggest criticism for Tina Fey and her time at the show, from what I've seen in my time podcasting here at the SNN, is a lot of people feel like the era in which she was head writer wasn't the best time at the show. And I think that some of those seasons are, not voted as great seasons. We didn't draft them when we did the draft very highly, but I think that some of it is hard to put the blame on Tina despite her being head writer. And I would say the reason for that is because she ends up being the anchor person or the quarterback of the show in a world that has to go through 9/11 and then try and be funny afterwards, where nobody wants to, and I just heard Amy Poehler talk about this on Final. Nobody wanted to hear politics. Nobody wanted to hear, religion talk. Everyone wanted to just talk about pop culture, talk about Paris Hilton and Lindsay Lohan and what was happening in the world then. And they sort of were, stuck in a place that they couldn't get out of for a while. Also, losing Will Ferrell probably doesn't help, but these are things that I think that factored into people's perception going back to those seasons that I don't know is exactly fair to Tina. So I'm not completely resolving her for being the head writer during those couple seasons that I think are not highly regarded, but I think you just have to look at everything when you're having these discussions. So Kirsten, I would love to know from you, do you have any perspective on this? And then let's talk about some of those moments that we really do love from Tina on the show.
Mm-hmm. Those are all really interesting points. And I, at first I thought, no, but I hear you. And I think even politically there was a real paradigm shift in how politics were happening and occurring in the United States. So it was a tough one. It really was. So yeah, I hear you. I think what outweighs that is as you said, the idea that she came in and said, women can be friends, we can support each other, and we can do this together. And although we've had to in the past feel like we're competing for things, I use the word posse, she really galvanized that for the show. And I think that's what makes her stand out so much. And it's not necessarily something you could put your finger on if you were describing kind of what she did there, but all the women that came out of it, again, you look outside the show and they all still do work together. I mean, I think they're friends in real life. Tina and Amy show up to present an award on a show like the Emmys or the Oscars, and we freak out because it's that magic quality that they have. So she definitely made her mark against some headwinds. And I think the female part is one thing I really enjoyed. And a lot of the sketches reflect that too. Like you have up here Annuel and Brownie Husband. There's also Woomba, where she really started to take the piss out of some of these lady tropes and stereotypes that were out there and kind of take the blinders off of how the marketing and TV and commercial world was looking at women as consumers and such. So I think there's a lot to applaud her for in that respect.
Yeah. And like I said, you could look at her run on the show and then end it at 2006 and be like, how do I evaluate her as a cast member? Or you could also take into account that she does come back a bunch of times, host 6 times, guest 6 times. And she is brilliant in many of the things that she does when she comes back to be on the show. We talk about Meet Your Second Wife as one of the best sketches of the 40s of SNL. And like, that is a sketch that, that's Tina and Amy out there and, their partnership. And I do think about comparing the group of women on the show. Not only are they extremely talented, but they're so close with each other. Like you see that in the 35th anniversary Betty White episode, where you have all of those women back together, and her relationship with, Rachel and Amy and Maya. Like you don't necessarily get that in other eras of the show. Like I do think about Jan and Nora being close, but legend tells that Victoria was not really tight with them and stuff like that. And I just think that like Tina's ability to bring the women of SNL together and then thrive on the show is something that like really boosts her legacy for me. Eric, what are your thoughts on all of this and some other moments from Tina Fey's time at SNL?
Yeah, I have to agree on how she sort of corrals the women together. I love the word posse for it for some reason. I just watched a sketch or a Weekend Update bit where she sort of tears into this article that talks about how career women shouldn't wait to have children. And she, does her classic Tina Fey, like, oh yeah, like that article's like definitely right. But she has that sarcastic wit about her that I can't really pull off. But she does it so well. And then at the end, all of the women of the show, sort of corral around her and are like, yeah, that article's so right. And then at the very end, I think it was a week after Anna Gasteyer had given birth, or maybe she was still pregnant. They're like, oh, let's go look at Anna Gasteyer's baby. So it's great to see, that corral of women around her. I think the one thing that is sort of a detractor is a lot of the sort of homophobic jokes that you see on Weekend Update at the time. And coming from some of the sketches, they don't bother me as much, but coming from Tina, they actually bother me quite a bit more because she's so politically sharp and she's so smart. And it's just like really hard to hear a lot of that coming from her. So if I had like one criticism of her time on the show, it's definitely that. But I don't know how much we want to go into that can of worms here. But yeah, I mean, as a whole, she's just, really smart on the show. Really great for the women on the show as a whole.
Does it feel like she was the first woman to almost get a seat at the big boys table, like with Lorne? Like if there was a small core group that went for dinner, she was probably the first female that was invited for her brain and not just her company. And I'm assuming these things, but I have the impression that she was respected on a different level by some of the folks there.
Look, I think that, again, like some of these conversations about what really happened at SNL over the years get watered down. And I think the general consensus is that she was sort of the pivot point for women in the history of the show. I'm sure if you were to go back to just even a few years before her and talk about, Sherry and Anna and Molly's time at SNL and how they fit in with the rest of the cast, I'm sure that there were also great moments where you could say that they sat at that table. I believe that, Jan Hooks was wildly respected during her time at the show, and Nora as well. And then even going back to the days of Jane and Lorraine and Gilda, I mean, I think they all had their place in history. But I do think that Tina probably became a decision maker at the show, unlike any woman before her. And I think that she had the ability to make change at the show. And, that, like you described her as a trailblazer, like I believe that she is. And that's why, despite those things that, and by Eric, there's, on this podcast, we don't dodge anything. Like I agree. There was some really bad stuff that went on at SNL and some of the jokes on Weekend Update in the early 2000s that came through, Tina and Jimmy's Weekend Update era and even in some sketches. But I also want to, say that like at the same time, there was a lot of progress that was being made eventually through her. And, just to give full context of the story,
Can I just say too, and I want to clarify, I think it's not that the women haven't been respected, because I think women before that, of course they were. They're comedic legends. But what you said about her having influence and decision-making power, that to
Right.
me was another level that I think she achieved, unlocked, what have you, where it's the women before her all had great contributions, and I'm sure were well loved, well liked, respected, all of these things. But she had a seat at the table in that she was, courtesy of being head writer or how she got it, someone who had a vote. I guess I could say it that way.
Yeah, and I also want to say, like, I know some people in the chat are talking about some of the other women who were writers at the show prior to her, like Marilyn Suzette
Mm-hmm.
Miller and Beats, Rosie Schuster, and like back in the beginning, Christine Zander, I saw brought up during that like second grade era, was such an amazing writer. Bonnie Turner, like there's a lot of
Yep.
really great women writers in the history of the show. But I guess the major difference here between Tina and all of them is that Tina was on camera, and as a result, the general audience was able to see her quarterbacking in the show in a way that we didn't get with those previous women writers. Not to say
Mm-hmm.
that they didn't have an influence on the direction of the show, especially writing for the women that were on camera, but Tina got to write and then go out and, be quarterback on the playbook. And I just think that is a major difference here, and probably why she does get that credit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Lauren like really wanted her on Update, right? Like it wasn't necessarily that she was asking for it. It was something that Lauren sort of handpicked and said, "You're going to be on Update. Like, we want you in the room. We want you to be a
Yeah.
face."
For sure. I mean, it is very funny to go back to the times where she is just a writer on the show and then see her asking questions to host in the audience, like as in those like pre-2000s days. And you see like a very young Tina Fey, like literally, she looks so young, and you're like, wow, this person is going to become one of the biggest names in SNL history. And it's like, it is so crazy to see her develop on the show. Like I said, have that great, time throughout those years, and then go off the show, go on 30 Rock, come back to the show so many times. And really, like, I do think that she is, we're talking about Emma Stone heading into the, Five Timers Club this weekend. I have to think that, like, if you're going to celebrate a woman entering the Five Timers Club, Tina's name has to be at the top of the list of people you would want to show up, because she's so representative of women and their time at Saturday Night Live. So to me, she definitely deserves to be celebrated. The question is, does it need to be as high as it is right now? And, I guess it really depends on how you view her time at the show. Is it just as a cast member? Is it everything she did afterwards? I will tell you that about 10 years ago, Rolling Stone ranked her as the number 3 cast member in SNL history, said she resurrected parts of the show, including Weekend Update, and then her sketches were now sketches at the time were now full of ass-kicking women. So again, they viewed things in a similar way that a lot of our viewers did, and that's why Tina is ranked so high here, not as high as 3, but at 12. So I guess my questions are for you, Kirsten and Eric. Kirsten, are there any other moments from Tina's career that you would like to bring up, and how do you feel about her ranking overall here at 12?
I'm happy with the ranking for all the reasons we discussed. I think she needs to be near that top 10. But I'm okay with her not being in the top 10, given the other talent. I, again, love all of the sketches that she wrote, and I love the appearances that she made in them when she was hosting, Brownie Husband, Blurt Out on Girls, Mom Jeans. All these moments were really perfectly captured by her, whether she was a writer or a performer. And I just think there was an intelligence and a cleverness to the way that she approached her writing and her performance that I really appreciated. So I'm thrilled to see her there. I agree with you that she probably could have had a sliding doors career that would have been just as successful on television, or her own show, a la Samantha Bee. Like, that probably would have been the cards for her. But I'm glad she was on SNL, because we got to see her do all these great things.
Eric, what do you think about her placement on the list in the end, and any other moments you want to bring up?
Yeah, ultimately, I think on a top 50 list of cast members, I might have her lower, just because her, as a cast member, she's sort of slotted to one place for the most part. but for what she means to the show and for the value she's added since she left the show, I think that she deserves that spot. There's some points in time in the last few years where she showed up on Update, and you can just like feel how important it is that she's there. So, when there were the UVA protests a few years ago and she shows up on Update, you're like, okay, Tina's here. Like, she's going to say something important. And I don't think that very many alumni cast members can do that. The only other thing I really want to say is I just love how she says good night and have a pleasant tomorrow. Like, I think that's a great callback to the beginning of the show, and especially a great callback to Jane Curtin. I know that Chevy was the first one to say it, but Jane said it like way more than him. And I think that a lot of Tina's delivery is sort of in a way modeled off of Jane, just that sort of straight-laced delivery. So I just love that she says that, and that she brought that back.
I agree. I love when cast members have an affinity for the show that they're on. So for me, that is bonus points for Tina Fey. All right, Tina Fey there at 12. Let's get to 11. The last person who is outside of our top 10, but still, what a high placement and well-deserved for the next cast member we're going to talk about. This is somebody who I will say was one of my favorite cast members to watch on the show. Just blew me away every single time I saw them on screen, and somebody that I would also describe as a trailblazer. So let's talk about the one, the only, at number 11, Gilda Radner here, 5 seasons on Saturday Night Live from 1975 to 1980, 106 episodes at the show, was there for all those first 5 seasons, 39th all time, 505 sketches, 31st all time. And yeah, I mean, Gilda, unbelievable, just the most exciting person to watch for me every single time they got on screen. I talk about that original cast, and I'm like, I love Dan Aykroyd. He's the guy who I feel like just anchored all those sketches in a way that I just feel like made the show so watchable. But Gilda Radner to me was like that spice that I could not wait to see what she did on the show, because to me she was so sweet and so like such a beautiful performer, and then could turn around and do Rosanna and be so different. And it was just so amazing to watch. And like, for all of the problems we've heard about in the 70s about, people like Belushi saying that women aren't funny, and other, criticizing how women really do on Saturday Night Live, I think it was general consensus everywhere that Gilda was hilarious and was so great on the show. And I do think if you pluck Gilda Radner out of SNL and the universe of Saturday Night Live, I think that the show is monumentally worse. I can't imagine a series of SNL without Gilda Radner in it. And wow, do I wish that she could have been around to come back at the show multiple times. I mean, that is like, to me, just one of the most like, alternate universe moments where I'm like, she just came so close to hosting once and could have been back. And I wish we still could have had her around, but there's so much to talk about here with Gilda and celebrating her life and her career at the show and all of her great moments. So, Eric, I will start with you on this one. So what do you think about Gilda Radner here at 11?
Yeah, I mean, there's not much I can say that hasn't been said by, thousands of people before I was born. But she's just the beating heart of the first 5 seasons. I think there's a ton of cynical people on the show who are trying to be edgy. And if you don't have Gilda there to sort of like bring the cheer, then it's a very, very, very dark show. I don't want to know what O'Donoghue would have done without Gilda there. But yeah, this I think is a little too low for me. I find it kind of hard to believe she's not in the top 10, but I just love her so much on the show. I think of all of the actors in the original cast, she has like the best raw acting on the show, in conjunction with Belushi, perhaps. But I just think their acting is so good. She can just like deliver anything. She never flubs a line, and she just brings you joy whenever you see her. So go Gilda.
Kirsten, what are your thoughts on Gilda Radner as a performer, her time on SNL, and how she landed here at 11?
John, what you said about imagining the show without her, you're right. It would have, who knows if it would have been around, because she did bring so much levity to the kind of cool guy shtick, the like hubris and stuff of Chevy and them. Like, she just was so just this brilliant ray of sunshine. And some of the folks that are on the show to this day that I respond most to, and that I feel generally people respond most to, are the ones who leave all of their ego and at the door, and they just get out there and they're silly and they have fun and they embrace it, and they're okay if they don't look pretty or gorgeous or whatever. And she, I think, was the person who made that possible for everyone, because if you go back and you watch like Judy Miller and you appreciate how one person by themselves with no other props besides what's in a teen girl's bedroom, a blanket, a skirt, or whatever, and she's even having fun with those, how you can captivate an audience for so many minutes by yourself with so much energy and joy and passion. That's really, really hard to do. And I don't know how much people appreciate what she was able to evoke in us with just simple characters like a bubbly teen girl, and likely inspired folks like Amy Poehler and Caitlin, right? And kind of paved the road for all those types of characters as well. So I think she's a legend. I think she would have been in the top 10 if more recently people were familiar with her work. And I think it is such a, can I swear? It's such an effing, I won't swear. It's such an effing shame that we lost her.
Right.
Because she could have been on for decades. Like Kenan would have been beat with his record because she would have still been on the show. And she is someone who would have been born in a factory to be on Saturday Night Live. Like, oh, just what a wonderful woman.
Yes. Well, I think at least we would have seen her back many, many times over, had she been still around. And, I do want to talk about, so a lot of your listeners, you guys have seen every episode of the show, every season of the show. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but there are many of our listeners who haven't necessarily gone back to the 70s and watched Gilda, and they may have heard of her. But let me just tell you like a little story, which is that, our first 3 episodes of the show, George Carlin, where he is, a stand-up comic and not really in sketches. They're still trying to figure out what works. It's a variety show. We get then Paul Simon, who hosts the show, and it's really all musical. You only see the cast pretty much once as bees. Rob Reiner hosts the show then, and they're trying to still figure things out. We get a sketch called What Gilda Ate, which is the first time that you really get to see cast members of themselves, and it's fun. You get Belushi as Joe Cocker. They're really trying to figure it out. But it's that 4th episode of the show where Candice Bergen hosts for the first time, another 5-time host, which I hope to see this weekend. And Candy hosts the show, and she has this moment on stage where it's a sketch, I believe we called it Feminine Talk, where it's her sitting next to Gilda Radner, and they're talking about the ERA back in the 70s, which is the Equal Rights Amendment, and voting on that at the time. And they put together this sketch, or these sort of like almost like a fun interaction that you get to watch between the two of them talking about women's rights and whether to vote for it or not. And it really, to me, is the first instance on the show of getting to know these people as people, beyond them just being cast members. And Gilda opening up her heart and talking and having that moment. And yeah, it's she's sort of playing she says, I didn't vote, should I have voted? And I just love that interaction with them. I didn't know when I watched it the first time that I was going to get that on the show, but I saw it and it made me fall in love with Gilda Radner. And then to see her then develop and then do all these crazy characters and become this person on the show, it's just I just don't know that there's ever been anybody like her on the show, to be the sweetest person that just makes you want to give her a hug, but then also be absolutely crazy and wild on stage and just so much fun. To me, she's as unique of an archetype as we've ever seen on the show, and somebody that I do believe is probably in the top 10 for me, because she deserves to be celebrated in that way because she is so wonderful. So Eric, for you, any moments from your watching through Gilda Radner's career on the show that you would like to talk about?
Yeah, there's a few. So similar to the Candy Bergen vein, there's the moment in season 1, which is sort of a runner. I think it's the first Elliot Gould episode, where she's sort of fallen in love with Elliot Gould, and she keeps kind of asking him out or wondering why he's not, returning her calls or whatever. That's one of those moments where, obviously Gilda isn't actually in love with Elliot Gould, but it's so fun to see her, playing that version of herself. And that's a great moment for me. One that I think really illustrates her sort of technical skills and just her like flawless delivery. There's a sketch, I think it's the season 2 finale with Buck Henry, where there's a talk show and Buck Henry is sort of talking about his research findings to Jane Curtin, who's the host. And every point in a sentence where he would have some kind of punctuation, if it was written down, Gilda would say the punctuation. So she would speak out the commas, speak out the periods, speak out the semicolons. And it's just like a great showcase for her, like technical skill as a comedian. And I don't hear it talked about a lot, so I love to bring that sketch up. And
It's
then
a great one.
Yeah. And then the last one, which I think is my favorite Gilda sketch, is Candy Slice. And that one I love just because it's pretty late in her career on the show. And I think at that point, I kind of thought I had seen everything there was to see from Gilda. And then all of a sudden she just whips out this rock star. And she's has like the perfect drunken mannerism. She's doing all the stuff that you might expect out of Belushi, but not out of Gilda Radner. And it makes me smile every time to just watch that performance. So those are kind of my Gilda highlights, but obviously there's hundreds more.
Kirsten, what about you? Any moments on your list that you want to talk about from Gilda's career?
I think one of her famous moments is the ad lib with Candice Bergen, the extremely stupid. That is in every reel. And what a great moment when, much to your point, people thought, ooh, this really is live. This is crackling. Like, I'm interested. Because people didn't necessarily know what to take the show as. And then they saw how live it really was and how adept the performers were at ad-libbing and improv on television. So I think that was a pivotal moment. And that's part of what made her so memorable. I have a lot of heart for Lisa and Todd, the giggle fest that was Lisa and Todd,
the
with
nerds.
the nerds, with the Aykroyd as the kitchen repairman and his butt crack and them just giggling. Oh my gosh. I mean, that's just a dose of medicine when you need one.
Yeah, there's so many great ones, including we've discussed here on the podcast before about her Baba Wawa, which was her Barbara Walters impression, which I don't think Barbara Walters loved, but still was very, very famous. Emily Latella, and then Rosanna after that, which sort of like, was basically one was retired and then she moved on to Roseanne. And I hear like a lot of people say like, well, it was done so many times that we saw it week after week. It was like, what Stefan was back in the day, it was even more. But then again, the only times you could watch Saturday Night Live over again was if they replayed a show. Otherwise, you were seeing it once and then that was it. That was the only time you were seeing that episode of Saturday Night Live back in the 70s. So at the time, this is what people were coming to the show for. They wanted to see a Rosanna Dana. They were so excited. That was one of the big moments you would get. Like, oh wow, am I going to get to see that on Weekend Update tonight? It's like going to a concert and seeing someone perform their greatest hit. And I think like that was such a huge part of the 70s of the show. And then, you mentioned the nerds. I just think that Gilda's ability to play with every cast member, I think, is so amazing. The fact that she can, like, she's one of the people in the history of the show that I look back on. I'm like, okay, yeah, she has great moments with Jane Curtin, with Chevy Chase, with Lorraine Newman, with Dan Aykroyd. Like, it's just like you just like with Bill Murray, like there's just, you think of all these things. I'm like, wow, she's an amazing scene partner for every single person. Think of her and Steve Martin together. I mean, just that, how great they were. And I do think back to, that time where Steve Martin hosts the show and then you get the whole, discussion of Gilda passing. And, that is just such a legacy moment in the history of the show. It's a horrible moment, but it is something that I think is so important to the history of the show, that time where we get Steve coming on for, I believe it was a finale. And it's just that stuff is just so fascinating to me to think about. And I do, like I said, I think that had she, still been around, I think she would have hosted a bunch of times. She would have come back and she would have been like an absolute legend. I think, when you make the sports comparison to like which cast members in the history of the show would they like build a statue in front of 30 Rock for, I have to think that Gilda Radner would be one of those people. And from a numbers perspective, 4.76 sketches per episode, that is good for 10th all time. When she left the show at the end of season 5, she was the sketch leader. So she had the most sketches in SNL history when she left the show at the time. She in season 1, she was second overall in sketches. Season 2, second. Season 3, tied for 4th. Season 4, tied for 3rd. And season 5, 3rd. I mean, think about that. In the first season of Saturday Night Live, in a show which nobody knew would men dominate, probably. I mean, that's what was happening in comedy at the time. She ends up second overall in sketches from season 1 at the show. So to me, just has so many points on her resume that I think back her up as one of the greats of all greats. Rolling Stone back in the day actually did have her at 9. I said she was beloved prototype for a brainy city girl with a bunch of neuroses. I think it's a funny way to put it, but here we do have her at 11. So let me go back to our panel here. Eric, starting with you, any final thoughts on Gilda Radner and her place here at 11 on the list?
Yeah, you brought up the Nerds. You both brought up the Nerds and Dancing in the Dark. I just think that sometimes it's not always funny to see Gilda, but it's just so nice to see her on screen. And you can see that with those sketches. Like the Nerds aren't always hilarious, but they're just such nice sketches. And then she's in a lot of great Marilyn Susan Miller sketches that are the same way. I see this chat's bringing that up a lot. So yeah, she's just such a pleasure to see on screen. And really, I think from that first cast, she's the only one who really like shows who she is like as a person, and then can also do sort of incredible character work and sort of hide behind the characters as well. And yeah, I just love Gilda.
Kirsten, final thoughts on Gilda Radner here at 11.
Oh, in my dream world, she would be sitting in that armchair of the Five Timers Club, wearing the jacket and handing it out with a high five and a hug to everyone. And that's the world I'm going to live in.
Absolutely. And our friend Casey in the chat mentions that Gilda was supposed to host that season 13 finale. That writer's strike ended early that season. So yeah, of course, that is like one of those moments that we all talk about as SNL fans of like, what would the show have looked like had we seen Gilda Radner come back? Because you don't see her come back after that 5-season run at the show. So yeah, so much to talk about here. I'm interested to discuss where she will come in terms of resume to resume against people in the top 10. And, I'm sure for a lot of you, you will have her either in your top 10 or top 5. All right. One more cast member to talk about tonight. And this conversation, I think, is going to be interesting. This is a conversation I've been excited to have since we started this podcast series back a few months ago, because I have asked this question on the podcast before. Where do you rank this person in the history of the show? Because they have a resume unlike anybody else in the history of the show. And that is because at number 10, our first member of the top 10 cast members in the history of Saturday Night Live is Kenan Thompson. 21 seasons and counting at Saturday Night Live from 2003 to the present. Will he ever leave the show? We don't know. This could be Kenan's show until it goes off the air, if that ever happens. 407 episodes, first all time. To this date, as of recording, 1,634 sketches, first all time. 46 characters, 157 impressions. I mean, this is the king of longevity at the show. There has been nothing like this to compare it to, because I think everybody thought, all right, when you saw him on the show, great cast member, has their moments, really starts to find his way on the show, and then, goes through that era with all of his contemporaries, and then he just continues on to another era. And I believe strongly, because we do talk about Kenan every single week here on the podcast, that Kenan has had some of the greatest moments of his career over the last few seasons, where he has dominated on the show, unlike anybody else. Imagine that. Imagine being at your peak potentially in your 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th season. Like it's crazy to think about the stuff that he has done on the show. But the big question here is, how do you value longevity compared to other factors when talking about who is the greatest in the history of the show? Because clearly nobody you can argue with Kenan Thompson and what he's done on the show. I will also bring up the fact that he is a black man, and in the history of the show, save for Eddie Murphy, you haven't had a black man dominate the show besides Kenan Thompson. And, prior to that, it had been like 20, 25 years since Eddie was on the show, and different circumstances. But Kenan has found a way to do that. He's also seen the show become more diverse. And I will say, we talked about Trailblazers with Tina and Gilda. I have to put Kenan in that category because I do believe that Kenan had a lot to do with the show getting more diverse. So these are all things to talk about when it comes to legacy, and perhaps no one's legacy is as big as Kenan Thompson and Saturday Night Live. So, Kirsten, what do you think? Kenan Thompson here at 10.
You know, it's funny in watching the chat. I see, you know, contention a little bit, but I do think yes, there's longevity, and we have to respect that. But he also is great at this show. He's great at Saturday Night Live. The numbers bear that out. There is evidence of how great he is. And I think he said he's never going to leave the show. And in fact, I think the last ever, I'm hoping he doesn't come at any time soon, but the last episode of the show, someone's going to turn out the studio lights and we're going to cut to his reaction shot. And that's going to be it. That would be a fitting end for it because we all love his reaction shots, or I do. I think this one will be somewhat controversial, but the evidence supports not just the numbers, but like his performance. The evidence supports him being near the top because no one has had a run like this. And he's just such a steady Eddie. Like, you have to give it up for him. Is he leaving the show to be a Will Ferrell? No. But is he an anchor of the show? Yes.
Yeah. I think he's like, we talk about Phil Hartman as being a glue guy. Like, I just think that Kenan like glues the show together in a way that like connects the last 20 seasons of my life and the show in a way. I can't praise him enough. I do think that it's just this is one of those guys, like, had he been on the show for 5 years, are we talking about him in the top 50? Probably not. Had he been on the show for just 10 years, maybe in the top 25, but he's, like I said, 21 years at the show, Eric. I mean, this is unlike anybody else we're going to be talking about. So what are your thoughts on Kenan at 10?
Yeah, I can't imagine him really any lower than this just for longevity alone and his ability to just sort of balance out the show over the last 10 years where he's really been the mainstay. I think he's so interesting because he kind of has two halves, right? You have Kenan while his sort of original cast is on with Bill Hader and Fred Armisen and Kristen Wiig. And then you have Kenan after they leave. And I think that there's a pretty large difference between the two. Like, as you said, if we were doing this list 10 years ago, I don't know that he would be in the top 25 at all. But since he's been, the staple of the show, we've just grown so accustomed to seeing him. We know his mannerisms, like we know what he can do that will make us laugh. And I think that he's just very comfortable to have him there for us. And, the show hasn't been stellar in the last, however many years. So he's just been so great to have along with the ride.
Look, I think that the show, when all is said and done, I believe that the last 10 years of SNL will be remembered for, the Kate and Cecily's in the 80s, like dominating the show post, Kenan's original cast. And I just think the reason, not that they're not great, but I do think part of the reason for that is that what Kenan does on the show is so underrated. Like, I don't think that the naked eye can spot how good of a cast member Kenan Thompson is. And that's like the major difference here is like sometimes it takes going into the deep analytics to understand like how much he anchors things on the show. And that like for the last, let's call it for the last 15 years, writers at the show knew that they could count on Kenan Thompson to make their sketches better. That if they wrote a sketch that was 75% good, Kenan would bring it up to 80 or 85. Like that, like he is just so valuable. To me, he may be one of the most valuable players in the history of SNL. And that's where I think he deserves to be in the top 10. So you did bring up like his first career on the show and then post, Eric. So he has a 4.01 sketches per episode average since his time back in 2003 all the way to now as a cast member. So before season 38, where you had all of his contemporaries there, he was at a 3.55. So on average, he's up half a sketch. But since that time, since season 38 on, he's at a 4.37. So, he's gone up significantly in that time since he's become like the veteran staple of the cast. And if that was it alone, I would be like, okay, that's not good enough to me to be like, you're a top 10 cast member. But it is the fact that over the last few years, he has been the sketch leader, the screen time leader. He has had moments on the show where we're like, thank God Kenan is on Saturday Night Live, because that episode was only good because Kenan Thompson did something great tonight. And I just think that that is so important. And I think he's underrated, honestly, if I have to say. I think he's probably the most underrated cast member in the history of the show, despite his name recognition. So let's talk about some moments that we love from his career, Kirsten. And I'd love to go to you. Anyone on your list that you'd love to talk about?
Oh gosh, there's a long list. Okay, let me name a couple here. I loved strolling to the polls. I love this real sharp commentary about voter suppression. That's when SNL nails it. When they have an opinion on something, but they deliver it in that unique way that only they can. That checked every box for me. Reba McEntire, if you know that Andy Samberg pre-tape. I love all of the silly names that he comes up with, Reese DeWatt, also Sumpin Claus. Like, imagine 21 seasons of coming up with new characters. That you have to take your hat off to that, because even the most gifted of characters, I think even a Kristen Wiig, I love her, but each character sometimes felt like a bit of the same, just a little bit tweaked. And Kenan gets a bit of that, but 21 seasons of it, that's admirable for sure. I think, listen, he's got a star on Hollywood Boulevard right beside Lauren. Like, we have to, I think, yes, acknowledge that he is an anchor. He's the glue. He's dependable, reliable, friendly. He has the institutional knowledge of the show that he brings throughout all of these seasons. And it would be a very different show without him for many reasons. So I think it's right that he's there. I think it will be controversial, but I have so many favorite moments. Oh, you know what? Here's my last one that I can't believe I had named, is Diner Lobster. Go back and watch Diner Lobster. And he's not hamming it up. He is just straight performing, and it's incredible.
Eric, let's go to some moments on your list that you want to talk about from Kenan's career.
Yeah, I had all the Mulaney musicals. I think, he's sort of the key to all of those working. Really, a lot of the greatest sketches from the last 5 to 10 years, he is central in. So you have all of those. You have David S. Pumpkins, where he's sort of the guide to that sketch. He's the guide and the host to the Black Jeopardy sketches. And really, I think that, recently, I think SNL does really well on the racial humor. Like, I think it's gotten a lot better at that over the years. And I have to think it's like Kenan being there is a huge reason for that. So you have Black Jeopardy, you have Come Back Barack, you have Strolling to the Polls. You have the one where he and Chris, or was it? I think it's he and Ego are on that the news show, and they're sort of taking tallies on which race the crime is committed by. I think that works because Kenan is there. Mm-hmm. So just all of that adds up in Kenan's favor for me.
Yeah, you did mention Black Jeopardy. I mean, just so fantastic in those sketches. We have to talk about What Up With That. I mean, to me, that is like, we're talking about a sketch where Kenan is anchoring out of pure energy and just running around sweaty and doing his thing on the show. It is so fantastic to get to see him. In particular, I loved back in the day those Scared Straight sketches. We talked about that when Sudeikis came up a little bit, but his like Lorenzo McIntosh always made me laugh so much. Some other ones I have on my list. I do have, he used to do these Grady Wilson sketches where he would talk about, they'd be like, they would go to a bunch of different sex positions that he would do. And that to me was so hilarious, as they would make up these sex positions that Kenan would be acting out through the Grady Wilson sketches. They only did this twice, but there was this sketch called Eternal Spark of Love, where there would be like a scene happening in an office, and then he would like slide in as the narrator as like, ooh, yeah. And like, yeah. And like, that's the type of thing that I just think is so subtle, but like not celebrated enough, that like when you bring like almost like the Kramer like from Seinfeld, like walking in through the door and making everybody laugh. Like Kenan has that ability in a sketch to just like come in and turn the sketch on his head and make people laugh. But he could also just be that main person in the sketch that gives you that look that gives you such a big laugh and improves it. I do think back, I think this was probably at the end of season 47. We had this like home movies sketch where they did the whole like fast forward and rewind, and Kenan was acting throughout that one. And we were saying at the time on the podcast, like as he was like acting out what it was like to rewind in real time, we were like, oh yeah, like we don't get a lot of like Kenan just like doing something on screen that everyone's like, wow. But like that's because he has so many tools in his toolbox and he doesn't bring them out all the time because the show doesn't need him to. There are so many great performers on the show. And that's the thing about Kenan is that like, if you want Kenan to run the night, he'll do it for you and he'll be great at it. But the show doesn't always need it because they're so great at hiring talent that Kenan's cool with taking a step back and just stabilizing a ton of sketches. And I just think he's like an absolute Swiss Army knife. So to me, again, one of the pure most valuable cast members in the history of SNL. Yeah, just looking at the list of other stuff. I mean, we didn't really talk about some of his impressions as well, which of course his Cosby impression is very famous from back in the day. Charles Barkley that he does, which I know a lot of you love. His David Ortiz that came on Update. I mean, he is probably one of the Willie, like he's one of the better Weekend Update correspondents that we've ever seen in the history of the show coming on as well. So in terms of 21 seasons, just all over the history of the show. He's a very interesting person to evaluate. Rolling Stone did have him again 10 years ago, but they had him at 46 on their list. Ooh. They said 12 seasons and counting. So I guess 9 years ago, 12 seasons and counting, seemed more at home on Nickelodeon. Again, maybe that's how the perception was then, because he was just starting to, you know, come out of this other cast and develop in his own way. And, you know, the trajectory of Kenan's career has changed over the last 10 years, perhaps, where now he is celebrated more than he was then. I would have been curious had we, like before this list was created, I would have said like, wow, I really wonder how people view Kenan, where he would land on this. And I'm pleasantly surprised that he landed here at 10, because for me, I do think he's a top 10 cast member in the history of the show. I just think that the show has been, as a series, has been massively improved by having him there. So, Kirsten, any other thoughts you'd like to say about Kenan Thompson or moments that we didn't talk about yet?
I agree with what you're saying about not knowing where he'd land, but being happy that he's here. I concur. You had that point about him taking the back seat at times, and I think of that pre-tape, That's the Game, where Chris Redd just got to lean into a really fun character, and Harry Styles was there and Mikey Day, but Kenan played it straight, and it was the perfect foil for this kind of ragtag group of wannabe drug dealers. So he can do it all. So, you know, if there was a Thanksgiving dinner in which Kenan was one of my relatives, I'd want to sit beside him, or I'd be looking at him to get all the winks and jokes. Like, what just a lovely person he seems to be, based on everything that I can see of him on the show. And I hope he doesn't go. He just feels like he's a part of the wallpaper there in a good way.
Eric, what are your final thoughts on Kenan and anything else you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the value in Kenan sort of comes from like the trust that we've built in him over the years. I think I just love seeing him sort of guide everyone through the sketches. I loved him being the one to see Cecily Strong off last year. So yeah, I hope he continues to do that for at least a little bit longer.
And unbelievably, the final epitaph, I guess, whatever you're going to call it, for Kenan Thompson, like, it hasn't been written yet. We don't know how this story will end with Kenan Thompson. Will he be on the show for another year, 5 more years, 10 years? I don't know. I mean, I think that if we ever do revisit this countdown, let's say 10 years from now, is Kenan still on the show? Like, does he continue to rise as we go on? Or is there at a certain point, is there a drop off where it's like, all right, you've been on the show for 30 years now. Like, you know, but either way, I just think it's very interesting. Unlike Bowen Yang and Ego Wodum, who we talked about, Mikey Day, who we talked about earlier in this conversation, there is, you know, enough here to talk about with Kenan, enough ups and downs in the career where I think we can get an idea of how he does rank compared to his contemporaries. So that is it. That is Kenan at 10, and we still have 9 more to talk about in this top 10 in the history of SNL. And I can't wait. These conversations have been so exciting, but we're not done tonight, because every single week we have one final segment, and that is me bringing up my list in comparison to the list that is out so far. So every week I slot in the new cast members and tell you where I place them in this list of now 41 cast members. So Eric, I'm very excited to get your thoughts on this, because I know you've been watching week to week to see how you feel like I did. So here you go. We got on the left side, we got the cast members so far as revealed by the public, or by the public, voted by the public and revealed by us. On the right, I have my list so far. So from 41 all the way through 1, I put David Spade, Bowen Yang, Martin Short, Tracy Morgan, Ego Wodim, Chevy Chase, Sherry O'Terry, Mikey Day, Joe Piscopo, Tim Meadows, Adam Sandler, Jimmy Fallon, Seth Meyers, Taron Killam, Norm Macdonald, Vanessa Bayer, Anna Gasteyer, Rachel Dratch, Chris Parnell, Kevin Nealon. And then on the left side, I have 21 up from Bobby Moynihan, Beck Bennett, A.D. Bryant, Molly Shannon. And at 17, I do have Tina Fey here. I was trying to think about where to place Tina on my list. I was trying to think at other cast members, where do I compare her to? I think Andy Samberg is a very interesting comparison to me. Andy Samberg, who is not known as being a great sketch performer, but had that legacy where he changed the history of the show through the pre-tapes. I think that may be the right spot, because I think that him and Tina have a really interesting, this or that comparison, because Tina does change the game of Saturday Night Live through what she did for women at the show. Andy changes the game in terms of pre-tapes. Could be something interesting there. So I felt like Tina slots in there well for me. 16, Andy Samberg. 15, Maya Rudolph. 14, Fred Armisen. 13, Will Forte. Jane Curtin at 12. John Lovitz at 11. And my top 10 right now starts with Mike Myers at 10. Daryl Hammond at 9. Chris Farley at 8. Jason Sudeikis at 7. John Belushi at 6. Jan Hooks at 5. Bill Murray at 4. In comes Gilda Radner at 3. Dan Aykroyd at 2. And Kenan Thompson at 1 for me right now. Look, I'll start with Gilda. I think that Gilda, I really do believe, is so important to the history of the show. Like I said, the most exciting person to watch for me back in the day. I think that Dan Aykroyd's ability to stabilize sketches throughout the first 5 years, I think that the show needs Dan Aykroyd in those first 4 years at the show, I guess. To me, that is a very close, but I probably inch it towards Dan just a little bit. And then Kenan Thompson, for me, like I said, it's really hard. I do value longevity, and I feel like that is so important here. I just think when you're comparing cast members who are on for 4 or 5 years, someone's been on 21 years, I think at a certain point, I do value what Kenan has brought to the history of the show. And so I have him at 1 right now. Maybe over the next few weeks, I can consider. I do think that Dan and Gilda are ones that I consider potentially hopping over there, and we could talk about that when I get Eric and Kirsten's opinions here. There will be definitely some people in the top 9 that I have ahead of Kenan Thompson, but for now, I felt like Kenan and all the things to celebrate him in his 21 career. I'm going to start him here at 1. We'll see over the next 3 weeks if he goes up or down, but he'll be somewhere in that area where we are talking about near or outside the top 10. Kirsten, what do you think about where I place Kenan, Gilda, and Tina?
Well, now I understand your passionate endorsement of both of them, because I see where you place them. Do you not have Will Ferrell on your list? I'm just curious.
Well, these are only people who we've talked about so far and
revealed.
So,
I see. Okay.
Yeah, so if Will Ferrell was to come up over the next few weeks, then
I see. You're stopping at 41. I gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Yes, I see now why you've got Kenan up there. And how do you feel about him being at 10 versus 1 then?
Well, I mean, for now, I just say, up until this point, I just think with everything he's brought, the fact that the show has been on for almost 50 years, Kenan has been on for 40% of the history of the show, and he has continued to dominate late in this stage of his career. I just think it's really hard not to place him at 1. So that's why I have him there. Yeah,
I agree. You've got some old folk, some old timers up in that top 10 of yours.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we're talking about people who are part of the greatest times in the history of the show.
Yeah.
Eric, do you have an opinion on where I put Kenan, Gilda, and Tina here?
Yeah, I'm pretty comfortable with their individual placements. I think with Kenan's longevity, it is hard to compare him to Dan and Gilda. And then Dan and Gilda themselves, I think they bring such different things to this show that it could really go either way for me as well. I say my biggest bone to pick is not with Tina's placement, but with the disparity between Tina and Seth Meyers. Because I think Seth and Tina bring like fairly similar things to the show. They're both more primarily known for their update as well as their writing. Seth was on the show longer. He did more sketches, but Tina has more of that, legacy off the show, I suppose. So I'd like to hear some justification in that discrepancy.
Sure. Well, I think that the major difference between me evaluating Seth Meyers, who I absolutely love and was my update anchor watching him on the show, versus Tina has to do with the fact that I do look at these rankings as a totality of the history of the show and not just the time of these people as cast members. Seth Meyers does not have a Sarah Palin-esque return to the show where he comes back. Everyone's like, oh, is Seth Meyers going to be on the show tonight playing John Kerry? Like, that's not happening. And then, Seth Meyers has hosted the show one time and it was good. It was a good time to see Seth back there, but Tina's, hosted 6 times at the show, is one of the only women in the 5 Timers Club. I think that in terms of like their importance to the history of the show, I love Seth. I think he is I've argued for him for the Hall of Fame because I think he is that quarterback of that third golden era. And I do believe that, transitioning from Tina to Seth as head writer made the show's quality better. But I just think in totality, in terms of like individual contribution to the history of the show, I think you have to talk about Tina as being in that next tier above Seth.
Yeah.
So
I think.
What about you, Eric?
That's acceptable. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Eric, do you have an opinion on Kenan Thompson here at 1? You think that's the right spot for him right now?
I think I personally would have Dan and Gilda higher, but I understand why you would have him at 1, or why anyone would have him at 1, at least with the people we've said so far.
All right. Okay. So there you go. So if you disagree, you have every right to tell me. Put it in the comments as you go and watch us talk through this episode. Like I said, I knew tonight was going to be full of lively discussion because these are 3 all-time greats between Tina, Gilda, and Kenan Thompson. And then we have 9 more to go over the next 3 weeks. So next week we'll have 9, 8, and 7 for you to talk about. But before we get there, we do have our Emma Stone and Noah Khan coverage of Saturday Night Live coming up this Saturday, where you can join us right after the show for the Hot Take Show live at 1:10 a.m. Eastern. We'll be back here with a great panel to break down all of those sketches. Will we see a 5 Timers Club sketch? That is a big question. We will see. So we'll talk about that. We got our Monday Night Roundtable next week, which will be a lot of fun. By the numbers, we'll be back next Wednesday, and then we'll be back next week for another edition of the greatest cast members in SNL history. Kirsten, thanks for joining us tonight. Anything you would like to plug?
Thank you. If you're in the Toronto area, please check out our seasonal intergenerational storytelling event that is women-focused. It's generationwomen.ca.
Eric, thank you so much for joining us as well. Anything you would like to plug?
Thank you, John. This has been a pleasure. So I'll be probably posting some YouTube statistics via my Twitter at SNLytics. So feel free to give me a follow there if you want to see.
Awesome. We have so much Emma Stone content coming out on our social platforms. So you got to follow us at the SNL Network. Find us on Twitter or X, and then as well as TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook at the SNL Network. You can find us and check out everything we got going on. Give us a follow. And to never miss a show that we have, you can subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. We just had our feedback show come out on Monday. So if you didn't watch that show yet, so much fun to get to answer all the questions. We had a ton of patrons come on with us as well. So that show is out on all of the feeds as well. All right. On behalf of Kirsten and Eric, my name is John from the SNN. We will see you next time, everybody. Have a good one.